Recording is
Yeah, so that it just works. Fine. Just drag it over. Oh, it's not working.
Okay. Okay. I'm trying.
Right, shall I touch on mute as well?
Yeah. Just click that mute. That's it.
How do I know it's on mute? Because it says mute.
It's not mute.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Menopause in the Workplace. My name's Rachel Davies and I'm a Principal Associate here in the Employment team based in the Bishop Stortford office. I'm joined by my colleague Joanna Sutton, who's a Principal Associate also, and she's based in the London office. We're also joined by our colleague Katrina in the Marketing department, so she's here to assist with any technical difficulties should we have some. And I also just need to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. So thank you all of you for joining us today. It's so great to see so many of you here and the interest in this topic. It's a really important topic and not many people are talking about it, but it affects over half of the population, so it's really important. And today, myself and Jo are going to talk for about 45 minutes, after which time there will be time for questions and answers. So please feel free as we're going along just to put any questions you have into the Q&A or the chat box, and we will be able to answer these at the end. So the topics we're going to cover include what is the menopause, the impact of menopause in the workplace, and employers' legal obligations, including how the Equality Act 2010 protects employees going through the menopause, the duty on employers under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, and then we're going to give you some examples of some recent case law where cases have been brought in the Employment Tribunal concerned with the menopause. And then we're just going to give you some guidance on support and adjustments you can make in the workplace to help your employees that are going through the menopause, and also some guidance on raising menopause awareness. So the menopause clearly isn't a new issue, but it's one that is very rarely talked about, and it's been behind closed doors for far too long. It's a really important issue. It affects over half of the population, and things are slowly beginning to change now, which is really good news. There's been a lot of media attention recently, and we've got celebrities. There's a lot of key female celebrities who have been coming forward and talking openly and honestly about their own experiences of the menopause and how it's affected them. And this is empowering ordinary women to talk about their own experiences and not to feel any embarrassment or shame about the menopause or the symptoms that they're suffering from. And it just helps women to not feel so alone, and they realise other people are going through this as well. So what is the menopause? Well, the menopause is something that affects over half of the population, and it's important to know that it doesn't just affect women, it also affects transgender and non-binary people. And it's a natural part of ageing, and it happens when a woman's hormone levels, particularly estrogen levels, decline. And it happens usually between the ages of 45 to 55, but it's not something that happens all of a sudden. It's a transitional period. And there's three parts to it. There's the perimenopause, the menopause, and then postmenopause. And the perimenopause is the phase leading up to the menopause. So this means that symptoms can begin at the age of 40 up to 5 years prior to the onset of the menopause. And then, unfortunately, 1 in 100 women experience menopause before the age of 40 years of age. And this can be due to a number of factors. It can be down to genetics. It can be because a woman's had cancer treatment, such as chemotherapy or radiotherapy. It can be because a woman's had an operation or surgery, such as a hysterectomy, and she's had her ovaries removed, which can bring on sudden onset menopause, known as surgical or medical menopause. So in general, menopause symptoms usually last for about 4 years, but taking all these other factors into account, symptoms can last up to 12 years, which is obviously a significant part of our lives. So the symptoms vary, and they can range from person to person, and they can range from very mild to very severe. Some women can sail through the menopause without having any symptoms whatsoever, yet other women seem to suffer from very debilitating symptoms, which can have a devastating and significant impact on their daily lives. So 8 out of 10 women will suffer the most common symptoms, and the one that everybody associates with the menopause is obviously the hot flush and night sweats. That's the one that everybody recognises. And a hot flush is described as a searing feeling of heat that goes through your body, ends up in your face, your chest, your neck becoming bright red, profusely sweating, and these can happen without any warning and at numerous times during the day. So obviously this is not very nice in normal life, but this is affecting you at work, in the middle of a meeting or a presentation. This is really embarrassing and really horrible for women to deal with. And night sweats are basically hot flushes that happen in the night, and this can lead to sleep disturbance and even insomnia and headaches. Now, those are the physical symptoms, the most common physical symptoms, and they're the most easiest to spot. However, there's other symptoms which are more subtle, and these are psychological symptoms and can affect a woman's mental health. So a woman can suffer with problems with memory and concentration, and this is most commonly known as brain fog. And this is, for example, a woman struggling to concentrate on and focus on daily tasks. Some women find it hard to string a sentence together or remember what they're talking about. And a lot of women feel that they don't know if this is the menopause. They don't know if it's just they're getting older or they're anxious or they've just got a lot going on. So it's really difficult to know, to recognise the symptoms and know why this is happening. This can lead to a lack of confidence, increased anxiety, and even low mood and depression in the more severe cases. So this obviously has an impact in the workplace. It's not just a personal issue, because millions of women out there are struggling with these symptoms, and at the same time they're juggling their home lives and their work responsibilities. And unsurprisingly, 6 out of 10 women say their symptoms have had a negative impact on their work. So they're struggling through the day, hardly had any sleep, increased stress and anxiety, suffering from hot flushes. It's going to result in an inability to concentrate, an increased amount of pressure. And lots of women feel at this stage they're losing confidence in their ability to do the job when they're working alongside younger female colleagues or male colleagues. And they don't want to bring this to anyone's attention because of the embarrassment. So then this leads to feelings of stress and anxiety. And this leads women to having to take time off just because they can't cope with the symptoms at work. They've got no one to talk to at work and they don't feel they're getting any support. They're often embarrassed to talk to the line manager. And most women will not mention menopause symptoms, even if they're aware themselves that is what it is. And they'll say that they're feeling stressed or anxious, and that's why they're having to go home or take time off. So why is this a workplace issue? Well, it, like any other health and well-being issue in the workplace, that's what the menopause issue is. It's not just a personal issue. It does affect people's working lives, and it affects colleagues working with women that are going through the menopause as well. So this has a great effect on the working day. And now that everybody's living longer, everybody's working longer, there's more women in senior positions. Women of menopausal age are now the fastest growing sector in the UK workforce today. And recent figures show that there's actually at the moment 5 million women over 50 years of age in employment, which is the highest figure in history. 8 out of 10 menopausal women are in work. And if you think about it, the average age of the menopause is 51. This is precisely the time when many women have worked hard to get to the position they are in at work. They're at the peak of their careers. They've got a lot of skills, a lot of experience. They're often freed from the demands of childcare, and they're willing and able to put the most into their job. But this thing that's happening to them, that happens to every woman eventually, and simply happens as a natural part of aging, is preventing them from doing what they can to the best of their ability, and they're not getting any support. So there is still a stigma around the menopause despite all this, and it is seen as a personal issue. And there's some statistics from the CIPD recent survey which just shows that the impact the menopause does have on the workplace. So 88% of workers feel that the menopause has had a negative impact on their working life and career. So that's a huge percentage of women who are going through the menopause who say it's affecting their career. So, for example, 20% of women have passed on the chance of promotion because they feel they just can't cope with any extra responsibility. 19% reduced their hours. 12% of women have even resigned over this and just walked away from their jobs because they can't cope with what's happening to them and they're not getting enough support. 59% have taken time off work due to the symptoms. But what is shocking is that nearly half of the women who take a day off because of menopausal symptoms, they don't feel that they can tell their employer the reason for their absence. And as I say, they usually say a different reason, such as stress, because they're too embarrassed to talk about the effect of the menopause. And what doesn't help as well, there is a lack of understanding in the health profession, and GPs have even admitted that they don't feel they've had enough training in the menopause historically. And so when women go to a GP or a health profession for help and for prescriptions for HRT, for example, they're getting prescribed incorrectly. And 2 out of 3 women who go and see a health professional with menopausal symptoms are actually getting prescribed antidepressants. And women on average have to go and see a GP around 3 or 4 times before they actually get diagnosed correctly and get the correct medication. So this is just exacerbating all the anxiety and concerns that women are already experiencing in the lack of support. And if you think, GPs in the health profession are having difficulties supporting and understanding, then obviously employers are going to have even more difficulty. So it is a general issue. I can just see a few comments about the sound. I'm sorry if people can't hear correctly. I think our marketing, I think Katrina's on it, so I hope everybody can hear me properly now. Okay. So just moving on with the statistics. So 60% of women have witnessed menopause being treated as a joke in the workplace. So historically, when women have mentioned or they've been brave enough to say that they're suffering from menopausal symptoms, there's often been the nudging of elbows, the derogatory comments, oh, she's past it, she's having a hot flush, she's going through the change, which, and often women themselves going through it feel that they need to make a joke about it because they're embarrassed, and they'll say things like, oh, I'm having another hot flush, just ignore me, or I've got brain fog. And it just exacerbates this feeling of isolation and loneliness, the feeling that people don't understand. And despite all this, 60% of women still say that the workplace offers them no menopausal support. And 900,000 women in the UK left their jobs over an indefinite period of time because of menopausal symptoms. So this is clearly going to have a knock-on effect on the UK economy and the workforce and the businesses. It's going to lessen diversity at an executive level. It contributes to the gender pay gap, and it feeds into disparity in pensions. So it's important for employers to understand that the risks of not recognising and supporting women in the workplace that are going through the menopause, this can have an impact on employees. So it's going to result in increased sickness absence and lack of communication from the employee, so you can't understand what the real reason for sickness is. Performance issues, which you aren't going to know is because of the menopause, and it's going to affect your performance monitoring processes. People leaving the workplace, women leaving the workplace, obviously the additional cost of recruitment and training is going to far outweigh the lesser costs of just simple adjustments in the workplace, which you can do to help your employees and retain them in their jobs. It's going to lead to discrimination and harassment, the derogatory comments. It's going to lead to grievances and disputes, and also employment tribunal claims. Apparently, in the last 3 years, employment tribunals have tripled in connection with claims for the menopause. So this just shows the impact that this is having in the workplace. And on that note, I'm just going to pass you over now to my colleague Jo, who's going to talk about an employer's legal obligations.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So I'm going to be looking at, firstly, what the law says about the menopause and the protection that employers are obliged to give to employees who are going through it. And then I'm also going to look at some of the recent employment tribunal cases that we've seen. And then I'll pass you back to Rachel to talk about some of the more practical measures that you can put in place to help support employees going through the menopause. So firstly, looking at what the law says, as Rachel mentioned, this is really a growing area that there has been much more media attention about recently, and as a result of that, there have also been an increase in employment tribunal claims, and that's across a variety of different sort of headings. So the first one is obviously unfair dismissal, so where an employee is dismissed and they say it's related to menopausal related symptoms. We're going to see in some of the employment tribunal cases how that has been borne out in the last few years. There's also constructive dismissal cases where an employee feels that they have no choice but to resign because of the way that they're being treated by their employer, perhaps because of the menopausal symptoms that they are experiencing, or some of the bullying and harassment that they may be being subjected to, and then also discrimination cases. So they can be on a variety of different headings, which I'll go through with you. So those are the main sort of heads of claim that we're seeing, and it really is an area that there is going to be increased number of claims going forward, particularly this year. I think there was Menopause Awareness Day last month, and I've seen certainly a huge amount of media attention, much more than I've noticed in previous years, with a lot of celebrities talking about it. Davina McCall's got a new book out about it. The royal family are also talking about it. So it's a huge area, as Rachel said. So the increased claims that we're seeing are those ones that are on the screen. There's currently no specific law in place that directly relates to the menopause. So there's nothing that says what you must or must not do, but it's sort of woven into some other pieces of legislation that you'll be familiar with. The first one is the Equality Act, which relates to discrimination type matters, and then the second one is the Health and Safety at Work Act. So I'll take you through both of those, but there's nothing specifically that, there's no Menopause Act, there's no direct law that says what you must and must not do. But under the Equality Act, many people think that perhaps menopause is a protected characteristic. So protected characteristics are things that you are protected against receiving discrimination in relation to. So things like age, sex, race, disability, things like that. And there's quite a lot of talk about whether menopause should be added to be a protected characteristic in itself, but at the moment it's not. But some of the symptoms that Rachel has mentioned, you can see how those could potentially be woven in as it being under one of these protected characteristics, and I'll show you what I mean when we look at each of them in turn. But basically what the Equality Act says is that you can't treat somebody less favourably because they've got a protected characteristic, and so that could be on the basis of someone going through the menopause and being of a certain age, so that could amount to age discrimination. It could be because they're a woman and going through the menopause, obviously that amounts to sex discrimination. Disability, if the symptoms are severe enough that it could class as a disability, and also as a result of gender reassignment. So we're talking in this webinar so far about this affecting women, but obviously it is something that could affect somebody who's gone through a gender reassignment process. So I'll look briefly at each of those in turn so you can see how they might apply. So firstly, age discrimination. So that is where somebody is treated less favourably or put at a disadvantage just because of their age. So it could be because of them being an older employee, it could be that they're a younger employee. But in this instance, when we're talking about the menopause, it could be less favourable treatment because that person is going through the menopause and they're of a certain age. So they're of that age bracket that Rachel mentioned, sort of 45 plus, although if they're perimenopausal, really from the age of 40. So it covers quite a wide range of employees' ages. But also it could affect those employees who may have gone through the menopause at an earlier age, as Rachel said, because they have perhaps experienced a medical menopause at an earlier date, or because they've had surgery or something like that. So it can affect anyone at any age. So perhaps thinking about somebody just being of a certain older age and experiencing the menopause isn't necessarily going to be the only thing that you have to consider. So age discrimination is something that is potentially a huge issue with menopause. Sex discrimination is another obvious one. As we said, women are the sex that are going to go through the menopause. So treating somebody less favourably because they're a woman and they're going through the menopause could amount to sex discrimination. And there could also be sexual harassment if there's particular comments about sex and things like that relate to the menopause. So that's another potential claim that can be brought. The next one is discrimination on the basis of disability. And that is where, for employment law purposes, disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on somebody's ability to undertake normal day-to-day activities. And menopause has been found in the employment tribunal cases that we're going to look at in a moment to amount to a disability in certain circumstances. Not everyone's symptoms are going to be so severe that they would amount to a disability, but in certain circumstances where it's having a significant effect on somebody's ability to undertake their normal life, then it can amount to a disability. And obviously we've seen from the information that Rachel provided that these symptoms last for quite a long time. So for it to be a long-term effect for employment law purposes, it has to have lasted or be expected to last for at least 12 months. And the menopause clearly is going to fit into that category. So disability is a huge area for menopause, and it's one of the areas that we're seeing the growing number of cases in. And obviously, most of you will be aware that where somebody is disabled for employment law purposes, what that means is that the employer has to consider if there are any adjustments that can be made to reduce any of the disadvantages that the individual is suffering as a result of that disability. So some quick examples here might be, for example, if somebody has been off sick because they've got menopause related symptoms that are affecting them so that they don't feel able to undertake their normal work. What you could do is perhaps record that sickness absence separately from normal absence, so that if you've got trigger points in your absence management process that normally mean, well, yes, that means that person's got to come in for a capability meeting or something like that. If it's just because of lots of menopause related symptoms, what you could do as a reasonable adjustment potentially is not to count that absence towards the performance management process that you normally would. We'll talk some more in a bit about the other adjustments that can be made, but that's a potential one that you could do, or adjusting start and finish times, for example. Quite easy things that you could do where someone is experiencing severe symptoms, so that potentially if they are classed as disabled, that you're making the adjustments to make sure that they're not placed at a disadvantage. And we'll look at some of the cases that the tribunal have looked at in a moment. And I mentioned briefly about gender reassignment. This is obviously a delicate area, but potentially because menopause affects women, as I said a short while ago, if somebody has then gone through a gender reassignment process and has perhaps transitioned into identifying as a man, potentially if they haven't, depending on the medical procedures that they have had, it could be that they would still experience menopause symptoms at some point. And so potentially there could be gender reassignment discrimination as well. Needs to be handled obviously incredibly sensitively, and the risk is that you could potentially out somebody who has been through gender reassignment inadvertently when they start going through the menopause. So that's definitely an area to be aware of. As I say, we're talking about women, but potentially it comes into that area as well, where somebody may have transitioned into being identified as a man. So discrimination, we'll all know there's different types. Just very briefly, you can have direct discrimination, which is where somebody is treated directly less favourably because of that protected characteristic. So because of their age, because of their sex, because they've got a disability. But also, and particularly importantly for menopause, there could be indirect discrimination, which is where you're applying something to an individual who has a protected characteristic that means that they're treated less favourably as a result of it. So, for example, that performance, the sickness absence policy, if you're saying that everybody, once they get to a certain amount of sickness absence, they then have to go through some kind of capability procedure, and the person who is experiencing the menopause has had more time off sick because of their menopause related symptoms, it could potentially be indirect discrimination if the only reason you're treating them differently is because they're experiencing the menopause, and that could then amount to indirect discrimination, because if they weren't experiencing it, then you wouldn't be treating them in that way. And so even though you're applying the policy across the board to everybody, it could still amount to discrimination. So those are the types of discrimination risks that we're looking at here. The next thing to consider is the Health and Safety at Work Act, and that applies where somebody is, move my slides on. The Health and Safety at Work Act applies where the employer has to conduct a risk assessment, basically, to make sure that everybody at work is being kept safe. So you need to make sure that everyone's health and safety at work is protected, and to do that you need to undertake risk assessments. You'll know this from everything that you do normally, but menopause perhaps isn't something that has been involved in risk assessments, but it's something that you really need to do to make sure that the particular risks that a woman experiencing the menopause, that you are identifying what those risks are, and if possible making adjustments to account for them. So it could be looking at someone's working environment, so making sure, for example, that there is sufficient temperature control if possible. So if you've got air conditioning, making sure that it's set at a reasonable level that sort of accommodates everybody within the workplace. Or it could be making sure that you've got access to cold water, for example. It might be if you've got staff who have to wear a uniform, that you're making sure that they aren't wearing a thick, heavy uniform, that if they're experiencing hot flushes or something like that could make their symptoms worse. So again, it's about looking at potential adjustments that you could make if your risk assessment highlights that there are potential issues. And those changes can be relatively simple and fairly low cost to put in place. And Rachel will talk about some of the adjustments that can be made to deal with any issues that you might identify. So going on then to look at the cases, and these are cases that are quite outrageous, really, in terms of the things that happen. I mean, people quite often say to me as an employment lawyer, you know, things like this don't happen anymore, though. You know, people don't say things like that anymore. And I've never failed to be amazed at the things that actually go on at work. And so you'll see what I mean in a moment. So the first case here is Merchant and BT. So BT, British Telecoms, massive company, everyone knows them. And in this case, Ms. Merchant had worked for them for 24 years, and she reached the age where she started going through the menopause. And she told her manager, and she said that actually she felt like it was affecting her concentration and her performance at work. They started looking into these performance issues that she was experiencing and got a report from her GP, which good so far. That indicated that there were health problems that she was experiencing that related to the menopause. Unfortunately, the manager decided to disregard the medical evidence that the GP had provided, and instead decided to rely on his own experience, because his wife had been through the menopause, and also an HR advisor at BT that was involved in the case who had been through the menopause. And they thought they knew better, because those issues hadn't affected them, or hadn't affected the manager's wife, hadn't affected the HR advisor. And so they decided not to take any of the medical evidence into account and just dismissed Ms. Merchant for poor performance. She brought a claim, good for her, in the Employment Tribunal for sex discrimination. And they found that the manager had failed to follow BT's capability policy, which specifically said that they should take medical advice when they were considering whether there were performance issues that could be affected by a medical condition. And the Employment Tribunal in that case found quite damningly that the manager didn't take the menopause seriously, and that he would not have taken the same, and this is a direct quote from the judge, the same bizarre and irrational approach with other non-female related conditions. So basically she was treated less favourably because she was a woman, and they found that a male with performance issues would not have been treated in the same way as she had. So quite outrageous decision there, but they get better. So this one, Davies and Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, this involved an individual who was working for the courts. She was a court clerk, and when she was in the courtroom, she would have a jug of water on her desk. And her employer, the Tribunal Service, dismissed her for gross misconduct because they thought she had lied and they thought she brought the court into disrepute. And that was basically because the jug of water that she had on her desk, she would put her medication into that she needed to take for cystitis and some menopause related symptoms. And she had this jug of water on her desk, and she left the court. And when she came back, the jug was not there anymore, and she saw two of the court users drinking water, and she panicked and thought, oh my God, they're drinking the water that's got my medication in it. And so she told them, and they were obviously quite concerned that they may have drunk medication that they had not been prescribed. And so a big investigation ensued, and eventually the Tribunal Service decided to dismiss her because they thought she'd lied. She'd brought the court service into disrepute because of the way that she'd approached it with these two court users. The employer in that circumstance had got an occupational health report that confirmed that the individual had menopause symptoms, and that these caused her to be forgetful and confused, and that could affect whether she had remembered whether she had put the medication in the water or not. When she brought this claim in the employment tribunal, the tribunal found that they had not taken that evidence into account. That there was clear evidence that she had been affected as a result of the menopause, that it had affected her behaviour and her concentration. And the tribunal in that case ordered that she should be reinstated into her post. She was awarded £19,000 compensation, so £5,000 for the discrimination that she was subjected to because of the treatment that she had, and then £14,000 by way of back pay for the period from the date she was dismissed until the date that she was reinstated. So again, another example of employers sort of trying to do the right thing by getting medical evidence, but then thinking they know better and disregarding it. So really a lesson to be learned then, to be properly taking into account medical evidence if you are going to obtain it, which, you know, our advice normally would be that you should, but make sure that you're using it properly. The next case here is Bon Marché, so high street store. In that case, the individual had been working for this company. Her manager decided to start bullying and ridiculing her because she was going through the menopause. And so he did that in front of staff and other customers. They caused her huge embarrassment. He did things like called her a dinosaur. He refused to make any adjustments to her workplace, so he wouldn't reduce the temperature when she said that she was too hot. And he encouraged other people to laugh at her when he was making comments about her suffering from the menopause. There was then a restructure, and she wasn't affected. Her role was not affected at all by it. But despite that, the manager encouraged other people to apply for her job, which again caused her massive insecurity and, you know, made her feel like she wasn't welcome. She took quite a lot of time off sick, and eventually she managed to agree with HR that she would return to work, and she would do that on a phased return, working shorter hours. So far, so good. But the manager decided to get involved again. And despite this agreement that she'd reached with HR, he decided that no, she should be working full time. She should go back to normal. What's the big deal? And he told her that if she wanted to work part time, then she would just have to use her holiday. And so completely reneged on the agreement that she had reached with HR. So she tried, she came back to work. She asked him if she could leave the shop floor to have a drink of water and to take her medication, and her manager's response was that she was pushing her luck. So eventually, understandably, she resigned and sadly suffered a breakdown as a result of the treatment that she'd been subjected to. She brought claims for age and sex discrimination, which was successful, and she was awarded £28,000. There was £18,000 compensation for discrimination and £10,000 by way of loss of earnings. So again, fairly substantial award for some quite shocking treatment that she was subjected to, again, by a household name. So the next case here is Donachi and Talent Technology. This was a case from last year, and the Employment Tribunal there had to consider whether or not the menopause symptoms that this individual was experiencing were enough to amount to a disability. She suffered from hot flushes, she had palpitations, anxiety, disturbed sleep, all of those things that Rachel had mentioned are common symptoms. Her GP wrote to her employer and confirmed that he'd seen her several times, that she was experiencing menopause symptoms and that she was actually significantly distressed as a result of them. Despite that, again, got the medical evidence, but the employer said, no, they're just typical menopause symptoms and that this isn't sufficient to amount to a disability. But the judge in that case, when the claimant brought the claim, said that actually typical menopause symptoms could still constitute a disability if the impact that they were having on the individual was more than minor or trivial. And in this case, he found that the range of activities that the individual employee could do had been markedly affected, and that the symptoms that she was experiencing were intrusive and disruptive, and so decided that actually they were sufficient to amount to a disability, and she was successful in her claim as well. One of the most recent cases is Rooney and Leicester City Council. Again, you know, local authority should know better. And this claim was for disability discrimination. The individual was experiencing severe menopause symptoms, and she didn't get any management support as a result of them. She told her manager, who was a man, that she was suffering from hot flushes. His response was, oh yeah, I get hot in the office as well, and completely dismissed the fact that it was because she was suffering from menopause. She suffered from a lot of the other common symptoms that Rachel mentioned at the start, so things like insomnia, fatigue, lightheadedness, confusion, stress, anxiety, palpitations, all of those kind of things. She was often quite forgetful, so similar to the case that we saw with the jug of water in the court. She would forget whether she'd locked her car, or if she'd left the iron on at home, or if she'd locked the door. She actually found that she had to spend quite a lot of time in bed. She was taking medication, and she was being seen by a specialist menopause clinic, so she had quite severe symptoms. When she brought her claim in the first instance, the Employment Tribunal said, no, that doesn't amount to a disability, despite the wide-ranging symptoms and the severe impact they were having on her life. Unfortunately, she appealed, and the Employment Tribunal disagreed with the decision by the Employment Tribunal and said that they found it difficult to find anything other than that her symptoms were substantial, they were having a long-term negative effect on her ability to live a normal life, to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And they said that this was a disability. That, again, another case saying that menopause symptoms can constitute a disability for employment law purposes. So whilst not all women will experience menopause symptoms that are, you know, very severe, or even, you know, the common symptoms that we've seen in these cases, really what these cases highlight are the fact that these symptoms are so often downplayed. They've been downplayed by women who have been experiencing the menopause for years because they're embarrassed, and they're covered up by saying that, you know, they've got other reasons why they're not able to come into work. But actually, these symptoms are serious enough to amount to a disability in many cases. Next case is Kawanaka and textbook teachers. Again, another case in this year, really shocking comments in this case. And this was an individual who was experiencing the menopause at an earlier age. So as I said, it's not necessarily about thinking about people who sit within a certain age bracket. This individual was 37 and sadly was diagnosed with breast cancer and needed to have surgery. She was told that as a result of that, she was going to be forced into early menopause, and sadly that she wouldn't be able to have children. Her manager made these horrendous comments to her, saying things like, it's not like you're going to die. It's only early stages of cancer. It's no big deal. He referred to the fact that she was going to have an operation to deal with the breast cancer and reconstructive surgery as just a free boob job. And he told her that she was taking things really seriously, and the fact that she wasn't able to have children was no big deal. You know, all these horrendous comments made by an employer in modern times. And this is what I mean, you never fail to be surprised by what people say, but, you know, these are really shocking comments. Understandably, the individual resigned and she brought claims in the Employment Tribunal. And the Employment Tribunal found, rightly so, that her employer showed a lack of insight, sensitivity and empathy, which violated her dignity, and basically that the behaviour that she'd been subjected to amounted to harassment on the basis of her sex. And so that case was successful as well. So, I mean, hopefully that gives you a flavour of the kind of cases that we've seen in the Employment Tribunal, and these are only the ones that have actually reached the final stages where a tribunal have made a final decision. There are a lot more, as we'll all know, that go through the tribunal system. It's only really the 20% or so that actually reach a final hearing for the tribunal to decide. There's many, many more that go through the tribunal system where people were treated unfavourably. So this is a huge area, and as I said, the increased media attention on menopause and it almost becoming like the next mental health thing that we saw over the last few years, where people haven't spoken about mental health issues for so long and now have started doing it. And it's really becoming a big problem for employers to have to adjust their policies and procedures to make sure that they're addressing it appropriately. And I really think that menopause is going to be the next thing that happens to in the workplace. So obviously, if you end up with employment tribunal claims, you're going to have to pay compensation. Potentially, you've got legal fees. It's going to cause reputational damage, as I said. BT and Bon Marché, two of the cases, they're household names where they've treated their staff absolutely appallingly. And so, you know, the reputational damage that causes is huge. And the fact you're going to lose staff, as Rachel said, these often, because women are older when they're experiencing the menopause, these are women who are going to be in the more senior positions potentially within your organisation, and who if you're then, you know, losing them, it's going to affect the gender pay reporting, it's going to affect your succession and all the rest of it. So it affects everything. It affects people on a day-to-day basis. So it's something that is a growing area that really we all need to start getting to grips with. And Rachel is going to take you through some of the adjustments that we recommend you could make, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. Yeah, it's, as you can see, it's really important that employers are supporting women in the workplace and recognising the impact of the menopause, just to avoid the grievances and the complaints and the employment tribunal claims, but also just to be a good supportive employer. So obviously menopause is a health, safety and wellbeing issue, and it's really important for employers just to understand, open up the conversation and normalise the menopause so that employees feel comfortable in talking about it. Managers obviously aren't expected to be medical experts, but it's just being there to support your employees handle the matter sensitively. Don't assume anything, so don't assume that a woman of a certain age is going through the menopause or is suffering symptoms or even wants to talk about it. You need to deal with things on an individual basis, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution as with anything. But you know, you can start by making sure that your risk assessments take into account people that are suffering from the menopause and the symptoms, to make sure that these risks and problems can be eliminated or at least reduced. And there's some simple health and safety measures and inexpensive measures that you can take, which will make a big difference for women going through these menopausal symptoms. So, for example, just adjusting the temperature and the ventilation in the workplace for people that are feeling overheated, suffering from hot flushes. As Jo said earlier, the material, if you've got uniforms in your workplace, just consider the material and fit of uniforms and see if there's an alternative uniform people can wear if they're feeling uncomfortable or too hot. Provide things like desk fans, use of a quiet room for staff to just go away and sit in and have some time out without having to give an explanation. And simple things like just availability of cold drinking water and easy access to toilet facilities. So just simple measures like this can make all the difference. And obviously challenge any unwanted behaviour and destigmatise this issue in the workplace, and make it clear that you won't tolerate any derogatory comments or unwanted treatment of women going through this part of their lives. And other support and adjustment, so consider flexible working options. So if it's when perhaps women make applications for flexible working, just consider how menopausal symptoms may be affecting them when considering whether to agree flexible working, and this can include changing start and finish times. If women aren't getting enough sleep, they're suffering from insomnia, it might be easier for them to work at home if it's more comfortable for them in a home environment, or consider part-time working and job sharing. As Jo said earlier, perhaps consider your sickness policies and consider not counting menopause-related sickness against the employee, and adjust your performance management policies to take account of menopause symptoms, and just make sure you're considering those rather than just going through a standard performance management procedure. And to be able to do that, you obviously need to be opening up the conversation and making women feel comfortable to be able to talk about the symptoms they're suffering from and maybe why their performance isn't up to scratch as it was and what the reasons for this are. So there's a lot going on at the moment. It's really important that we're raising menopause awareness. It's important to train managers, and it's not always that managers don't understand or don't want to talk about it. Often managers are just scared of saying the wrong thing and feel uncomfortable as well. So it's really important that everybody understands what the menopause is, what the symptoms are, and that managers can talk and listen sensitively. Consider the individual needs of the woman. They might want to keep probably will want to keep any issues confidential, and just make sure you can signpost support. So know what support your company offers and signpost this support to the individual so they know where to go. You might want to consider having a menopause policy in place. So it could be a standalone menopause policy or part of your health and well-being or mental health policies. This just makes the statement that you are concerned about this, you are supporting people, and this can include examples of where women can go to get support within the organisation and examples of reasonable adjustments that can be made. You might also want to consider having a menopause champion, so a point of contact in the workplace so women know where they can go and have a confidential and open conversation with somebody. It might be somewhere where women can get together to share their experiences and just to feel that their voice is being heard within the organisation, and this matter is being taken seriously. Employers are now able to sign a workplace pledge just to show that you are committed to raising menopause awareness and supporting the employees in your company, whatever their age and whatever hormones dictate their health. And by signing the workplace pledge, you're recognising that the menopause can be an issue and that women need support. You're saying that you are talking openly about it, you're positively and respectively talking about the menopause, and you're actively supporting and informing your employees affected by the menopause. So as Jo said, there's a lot going on at the moment. There's all the media attention, there's the celebrities coming forward and talking openly about their experiences. In July 2021, there was a Parliamentary Inquiry into the workplace treatment of women go through the menopause, and this has resulted in a government menopause task force, which has been established to consider the role education has. So previously it's never been part of the education in schools, but now they're considering introducing this into schools as part of the normal education, training and workplace policies to see how these can support women going through the menopause. And only in October last month, the government announced that prescription charges for hormone replacement therapy, HRT, would be reduced. So at the moment, women in England have to pay for HRT. In Scotland and Wales, they don't have to do so. So people have been campaigning for this so that women don't have to pay, and it's going to be significantly reduced. And Timpsons have come forward as the first employer to agree to pay for all HRT prescription costs, and they've said that employees can put these through expenses. So that's absolutely amazing action on behalf of Timpsons, and hopefully this will set a precedent for other employers to come forward and make similar positive action to support their employees in the workplace. So that's the end of our presentation. I hope that's been useful. We've now got time to answer any questions that you may have. I can see that there's a question already in the chat box. Who decides if an employee's symptoms are severe enough for them to be classed as disabled? Well, as Jo went through some of the Employment Tribunal cases earlier, it's ultimately for the Employment Tribunal to decide whether an employee's symptoms are severe enough for them to be classed as disabled. Under the Equality Act 2010, a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial long-term negative effect on the ability to do day-to-day activities. So substantial means it's more than minor or trivial. So some of the symptoms that were described in these employment tribunal claims, such as if women are suffering from these on a daily basis, it's having an effect on their life. So for example, sleep deprivation, hot flushes, anxiety. And long-term effect is if it's happened for 12 months or more, or if it's expected to. So obviously, menopausal symptoms, as we've said, can go on for at least 4 years. But in a situation like this, if it's not clear, we'd advise you to get a report from occupational health or a medical advisor in the first instance, to decide whether it is going to be classed as a disability. But as I say, ultimately it's for an employment tribunal to decide, as you can see from some of those cases that Jo went through.
Yeah, definitely. And just following on from that, if you are going to get medical advice, then just make sure that you're going to take it into consideration and not do as some of those employers have in these cases and just disregard it and think you know better. And really, disability is something that, you know, should always be borne in mind as to whether or not something is crossing over. So you can, you know, yes, ultimately the decision is the employment tribunals, but it's certainly something to have on your radar to see if actually, you know, you think that this might be a disability case, not just in relation to menopause, but in relation to anything really. So it's always something that we're considering when we're advising clients. Rach, there's another one here that says, what are the top tips for how best a manager can support someone going through the menopause? I don't know if there's any top tips. I mean, certainly one of the things that we would say is one of the best things to do is not be too direct about it. You know, it's going to be difficult for a female employee to be having this conversation potentially with a male manager. So certainly making sure that your male managers are aware of what the menopause is and how people can be affected by it is a really good starting point. Try not to sort of ask directly, are you going through the menopause? Is it because, you know, you're going through the change? My wife had that. We've seen those cases where what happens if you take your own personal experience into account. So training managers, I think, is really important. That would be my top tip. I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Rachel.
Yeah, I agree with all that, Jo. And just to be really sensitive and don't make any assumptions. You know, everyone's an individual and everyone's dealing with this differently. Some people want to talk openly about it. Some people, even though they're suffering from it, will want it to be kept private and won't be keen to talk about it. So it's just not to make any assumptions, just to ask them, like Jo said, not direct questions about the menopause, but just how are you? You know, are you suffering? Can I help at all? And give them the opportunity to speak to you. And if they don't want to, perhaps signpost them to somebody else, perhaps HR or a menopause champion, if they would feel more comfortable talking to somebody like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's another thing, isn't it? It's something that those of you who are on the call today who are HR, it's probably something that you're going to have the employees coming to you about rather than potentially going to the managers. But because it is such a growing area, just making sure that managers are aware of what the potential symptoms could be and not just classing it as, you know, poor performance or someone being past it, or, you know, all of those things that that we've seen in the cases. So yeah, definitely those are good top tips. So another one, people are asking if we're going to circulate the slides. Yes, we'll do that after the seminar today. Have we got any examples or templates of risk assessments? We can certainly help with, you know, putting those in place for your organisation. And Health and Safety Executive have got sort of templates on their website. It won't be specific menopause related, but it will show you the kind of things that they would expect to see, a general risk assessment to protect health and safety at work, certainly. Richard's asked a question about whether the Timpsons putting through the HRT or allowing employees to expense it would be a taxable benefit in kind. I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I'm not sure, Rachel.
Sorry.
No.
Look into that and get back to you, Richard. I haven't thought about that actually.
No, I mean it's a good example generally, just of kind of one of those quick wins really that employers can do, you know, depending on the number of employees that you have, and with now the government agreeing to reduce the prescription costs, it could be fairly low cost for an employer to do that if you've got a relatively small workforce. So it is, you know, one of those examples of the adjustments that can be made don't necessarily have to be high cost and, you know, all singing or dancing. It's quite an easy thing to potentially put in place, depending on tax treatment, but we can come back to you on that. Rachel, well, someone's asked, what should we do if we think someone might be, you know, being affected by the menopause, but they haven't said that directly to us? How should you approach that?
Again, I'd say, as before, just tread carefully and sensitively, and don't make assumptions that you know, don't make assumptions just because of their age or some symptoms that they are suffering from the menopause. Don't ask them directly, but encourage them to speak to you, ask them how they are, and ask them again if there's anything you can do for them. And if they're not forthcoming, again, see if there's anybody else you would like to speak to, or possibly think about a referral to occupational health. It's difficult in those circumstances where you feel yourself that they're suffering from it, but they haven't opened up to you about it, because you want to support them, but you obviously don't want to just directly ask them about the menopause. So it's just, and again, it's an individual thing. It's just as you would with any mental health or health and well-being, just tread carefully and just be sensitive around it.
Yeah, definitely. And following on from that, someone's asked whether an employee needs to disclose if they're taking HRT or other medication to help with their symptoms. I mean, that would depend, I think, on your individual policies about medication. You know, if you're operating machinery or something like that, some policies would require employees to disclose that. Otherwise, there's not a legal obligation, and certainly it's something to, again, tread carefully around, not least because of GDPR. So because this will be sensitive personal information, because it's medical information. So you only need to take that information from somebody if you've got a specific reason to do it. So as I say, potentially if it's relating to, could affect their ability to operate machinery or something like that, then there may be an obligation for it to be disclosed. But otherwise, I would say there isn't necessarily a specific legal obligation. You know, it might be something that comes out naturally in those kind of conversations if you're speaking to an employee who's having symptoms, but it's then, you know, something that it's a sensitive topic, so there isn't a legal obligation necessarily for that to be disclosed to the employer, unless there's a genuine reason for it. I think that's all the questions that we've had through. I'll give a couple of anyone. Oh, we've got one coming through. Okay, so what's the legal stance if the symptoms like forgetfulness or brain fog are so severe that the employee is at risk of making a mistake that could cause reputational damage to the company? Does the employer have the right to suggest a change of role? Yeah, absolutely. You know, just because these things could amount to a disability doesn't mean that you have to just ignore them altogether. You know, you're still employing the individuals to do a job for you, and if it's affecting their performance, you are absolutely still able to take steps to address that. It's just that you need to take it into consideration as to why it may be happening, in the same way as you would with any other kind of medical condition. So again, with something like this, if you think that the employee has got menopausal symptoms that are affecting their ability to do their job, you need to be able to properly understand it, and really, you know, this is a medical issue, so it would be a case of referring them to occupational health or getting a GP report or a report from, you know, their menopause practitioner they may be seeing, to understand exactly what those symptoms are, and then looking at, is there anything that you could do to adjust their duties to assist with that? So it might be, yeah, they're forgetful, or they find the mornings particularly difficult if they've had a sleepless night the night before, so you could just agree that they can come in a bit later and work a bit later instead, and that may be enough to resolve some of the issues. But if it's not, then absolutely you can still address the performance issues. You just need to be sensitive in dealing with it and making sure you're taking into consideration any of the medical medical evidence. If there's something glaringly obvious that you could do to assist that person to change their role to make sure that they wouldn't be affected anymore, great. But if not, then yeah, you might have no option but to be thinking about a change of role or something like that, which, you know, absolutely still remains open to you, but you just have to tread carefully. And we would say, you know, take some legal advice while you're doing it, just to make sure that you're doing everything properly. But yeah, it doesn't mean that you have to ignore it altogether. I'm just seeing another one come in. Oh no, that's a thank you. Good. Okay. Any other questions that anyone's got while we're here? If not, if you don't want to put them in the Q&A, or Rachel and I are around all day, so feel free to pick the phone up or drop us an email or something like that, and we can you know, come back to you on any of the questions. Or, you know, if anyone then thinks that actually they might like some training for managers and things like that, we can certainly help with that as well. So but otherwise, just leaves me to say thank you very much for coming. I'm sorry if you experienced technical difficulties. I hope that you all managed to hear that there's lots of you still on, so hopefully that was okay for the rest of you. We have recorded today's session, so we can send that out if you were experiencing technical issues, and as I say, we'll send the slides through to you all as well. So thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.